All right. Sometimes it makes that loud recording in process. So if it happened, apologies. It's a little disruptive. All right. We'll go ahead and start now. So welcome. My name is Britton Slagle. I am the founder and executive director of KarmaSue. Our mission is to support Coloradan families enduring companion animal cancer through education, counseling, and financial assistance. We'd like to thank you for attending this counseling workshop today. If you're interested in watching any of our previous education workshops, please visit our YouTube channel. If you have any questions or would like to connect with us directly, you can send us an email at admin@karmasue.org. This workshop will be recorded, however, the Q&A will not. You're welcome to speak freely. The Q&A session will occur at the end of the workshop. If you have any questions as we go along, please enter them in the chat box directly to me or through our Google form, which I sent via email and will also put in the chat. I will moderate the chat and provide your questions to our facilitator to answer at the end. Also, please keep yourself on mute to avoid background noise, and please keep your cameras off simply because this workshop is being recorded. We'll provide you with a recording of the workshop in the coming days. Today's workshop is titled Silent Sorrow. Our special guest facilitator is Janna Dewey, and she is a behavior consultant and therapist for Behavior Vets of Colorado. She started in the zoo field and has been able to work with a wide variety of species within show and education rules. Throughout her career with animals, she experienced and witnessed the unique hardships that come with being an animal caretaker, whether that is professionally or in a home environment. Due to that, she decided to focus on the human side of the human-animal bond and is now a licensed professional counselor candidate and helps those who might be having difficulties coping with caring for animals. She is also a certified equine-assisted mental health practitioner through the University of Denver. She is particularly passionate about helping those coping with grief from an animal loss and offers specific groups to offer support for those who might be experiencing this. She also offers individual counseling as well as other support groups to aid those who are having trouble living or working with animals. We'll also provide those in the email after the workshop. We'd like to thank you again for attending our workshop today. Please remember that this is a safe space. You are among friends. As we conclude, we'll send you a brief evaluation via email. If you can, please complete it as it helps to ensure KarmaSue continues to provide workshop topics that you want to learn most about. I'll hand things over to Janna now to introduce herself and give you an overview of this workshop. Janna, take it away.
Great. Thank you so much, Britt. And thank you all for joining. I'm really excited to be presenting. Like Britt was saying, I work a lot with grief, in particular with pet loss. And so I'm very passionate about this topic, as difficult as it is. So thank you for joining Silent Sorrow. And so today we'll be learning to understand and recognize disenfranchised grief and become empowered to navigate your personal grief experience. So first, Britt gave a wonderful introduction. So this is just kind of repeating that a little bit. So just a little bit about me. So again, I was a zookeeper for about 10 years. That's where I really got to dive into the animal world. In between that, being a behavior consultant and therapist for Behavior Vets, I manage a boarding and training facility that specializes in behaviorally sensitive animals. It's called Training Wheels in Broomfield, amazing facility. I am also, in addition to some of the other certifications that were mentioned, I'm also a certified professional bird trainer. And like Britt said, I'm a certified equine assisted mental health practitioner through University of Denver, as well as a licensed professional counselor candidate. And so the reason why I'm really passionate about mental health and what got me to be here is I noticed in the animal care field, there is a lot of grief in particular, but a lot of burnout, compassion, fatigue. And I really wanted to give as much care to the human side of the experience as there was for the animals that we were caring for. In particular, the reason why I'm really passionate about grief is the horse pictured here. His name was Odin. He was a rescue. He unfortunately passed away quite suddenly. So I only had him for a little over a year. This experience happened while I was in grad school, beginning the early part of my master's program. So because of that experience and the amount of grief I felt and I still feel, I became very passionate about helping people because there wasn't a place to be able to talk openly, I felt, about how deep it felt for me. And, there's a lot of therapists, a lot of groups out there for human loss, but I was finding I was struggling with this pet loss, with his loss. And so that's why I am where I am and why he kind of drives why I do what I do. So before we start, I just kind of want to reiterate what Brett was saying. This is a safe place, and absolutely in the Q&A, please bring any and all questions, comments, concerns. But feel, oh, sorry. I thought I heard someone say something. Okay. No problem. But feel free to take breaks as you need to. This is a triggering topic, and I just want to recognize that this is really hard to talk about. So feel free to take breaks. I know you have your cameras off anyway, but take breaks as you need. If you're watching from home, recorded, pause this as you need to. It helps too if you watch this from a comfortable space. So if you can get all nice and cozy somewhere. And then again, this is just a triggering topic. So take care of yourself as you need to, food, water, do things that comfort you while we're talking. All right. So I first want to talk about what grief is. It's a big word, and there are a lot of things that cause grief. Lots of different losses can cause grief. So this is a definition, a general definition, which grief is a normal response to loss during or after a disaster or other traumatic event. Grief can happen in response to loss of life, as well as to drastic changes to daily routines and ways of life that usually bring us comfort and a feeling of stability. So there's the definition of grief. And then there are different types of losses that can cause grief. We tend to only think of physical losses. In particular, we tend to think of human loss. But we are all here because we deeply feel pet loss. We've all experienced it, I'm going to guess. But there are many other types of losses. So it's not just the death loss that's mentioned here. There's also what's called a living or life loss. So these are things that are happening that there isn't a physical loss, at least a physical loss of life. So this can be like a trauma can actually be a living loss because you might be losing a sense of safety. You might be losing a sense of security. You might have had to move, things like that. Breakups is definitely a living loss, divorce, loss of a job, loss of dreams is a really big one, especially if you're a caregiver and you have to maybe shift some of your expectations, some of your goals, you have to shift your life. That can absolutely be a grief you might experience. A victim of a crime, again, that loss of feeling safe is a really big living loss that you can absolutely experience. There's a positive loss, which is kind of that saying every beginning has an end. So even though it might feel really positive and absolutely be a very positive thing in your life, there can be losses and you can actually go through grief. Things can be like marriage. You might be losing a sense of independence. You might in transition be losing some of your things. You might be losing a home, things like that. Skipping a grade in school is another big one. Yes, it's absolutely positive, really great academically, but you're missing out on some social aspects. You might be missing out on some activities that were planned that year. So that's encompassing that positive loss. And then there's a non-finite loss, and some of these can kind of coincide with each other, but these are things that are more of a psychological response rather than a physical for us. So this can absolutely be loss of one's hopes, goals, ideals. It can also be a sense of insecurity. So again, if you're not feeling safe, that loss of safety can be a non-finite loss. And so again, especially I've seen this with animals a lot in training. We might get a puppy or we rescue a dog, and as they get more comfortable, we see some other behaviors. And so we might have to shift goals that you weren't really prepping for, and you have to kind of say goodbye to what you were thinking. And that absolutely happens in grief as well. And so these are just some of the things, the types of losses that can cause grief. And then we have many kinds of grief as well. So we have different types of losses that can create different types of grief. So again, there are many, many types of grief. These are just a few of them, by the way. This isn't even all of them. There's quite a few out there. So we have cumulative grief, which is where multiple losses happen at the same time. So it could be like loss of job. It could be it could be loss of a pet at the same time, loss of a relationship. So this is when things are compiled. There's anticipatory grief, which is a really big one, which is something we're going to keep talking about throughout this, especially when we're talking about euthanasia. Anticipatory grief is absolutely felt. So again, this is when a loss is about to happen, you start anticipating that and you're going through the grief cycle before that actual loss. There's chronic grief, which is where the grief just kind of keeps hitting us. We can't really get out of it. Complicated. This is usually when trauma comes into it, like it's saying. There might be some different thinking. We might have some anxiety, depression coming into this. And so that's that complicated grief where it's not just grief. There are a few other things coming into this as well. And then there's a collective grief, which is where we all kind of feel it at the same time, or a large group feels it at the same time. So the pandemic was a really big one. That was absolutely a collective grief. A lot of us felt a loss of safety, loss of friends, loss of our routine. So that's that collective grief that's being talked about right there. And again, there's many, many kinds, and it's really important to know that whatever type of grief you're feeling, whatever type of loss you've experienced, it is all okay. What it is dependent on each individual, and that's going to be stressed throughout this. There is no wrong or right way to grieve. There's no wrong or right type way. It's all kind of dependent on who we are as individuals, which we all have different experiences. So that's why it's so different. So disenfranchised grief is what we talk about when we talk about pet loss. And this is really a type of grief that occurs when it's not the loss of a human life. Basically, anything outside of that, which is kind of crazy to think about, anything outside of that can be considered a disenfranchised grief. So pet loss is considered a disenfranchised grief, and is very important to recognize that. And again, talking about that anticipatory grief, it can be experienced in animal passing. So what is this? So this can occur when a death is not recognized as a genuine loss. Bereaved individuals dealing with the death of a companion pet are at risk for disenfranchised grief because their loss may not be viewed as legitimate. Yet pets are now widely considered members of the family. The consequence of pet loss as a disenfranchised grief is that society does not acknowledge the bereavement when a companion pet dies, which may lead to complicated or unresolved grief. So basically what this means is pet loss is not societally recognized as okay, or I guess pet grief. So this disenfranchised grief, that's why it falls under it. Any grief that's not socially recognized falls under this, which is again, basically anything outside of the physical loss of a human life. And so it's really important to know because there's some feelings that come about when we experience this, which we'll talk about here in a little bit. But what it really brings about are some feelings of shame and guilt. Those are the most common when we're experiencing this type of grief. And it's something to recognize and normalize. And we're going to talk about the feelings that can occur when we're experiencing this type of grief and how to help yourself. And I'll give you some tools. But it's just really important to recognize that as a whole society puts a timestamp on this type of grief. It's okay for about a day. We don't have bereavement time for our pets, unfortunately, in most places. And so it's important to recognize this type of grief and what it is. All right. So I want to give you a little bit of science of pet loss and grief and why it hits us so hard. I'm sure all of you are like, we know why we love our animals, but there are a lot of studies about how pet loss impacts us. So it's really, really important to understand that it actually impacts us the same way as a human loss. There's not much of a difference. And there's that study kind of showing at the 2, 8, and 26 week mark, there isn't really any change between those who experience an animal loss or human loss. And the big part of this that drives how we grieve is the attachment. What was our relationship to that individual, human or non? Um, and that attachment and what that life meant for us, that is what drives that grief. That's why sometimes people have a pet might not have been that relationship, they might not have had a strong one, and so they might not grieve as much. Others, it's an extremely strong relationship, which is why we grieve so hard. And so again, it's just kind of to validate if you're sitting there hearing this at home and you don't understand why this is hitting you so hard. Society tells us it's just an animal, move on. It's a very common phrase, or get a new pet, all the sayings. But it's really important to recognize science shows that there is no difference. The attachment is what drives, whether it's a human or a non-human. So I want to talk a little bit about trauma because especially when we're going with euthanasia or we're caretaking for animals, there's absolutely trauma involved. And a loss can be traumatic. It is a natural part of life, but it can be considered a trauma as well. So I just want to go over what exactly trauma is, because again, it's one of those big general words. So I just want to define it for y'all just a little bit. So trauma is an emotional response to a terrible event like an accident, rape, natural disaster. Immediately after the event, shock and denial are typical. Longer term reactions include unpredictable emotions, flashbacks, strained relationships, and even physical symptoms like headaches or nausea. So a loss can also fall under this, especially if we're caretaking, if we're witnessing a decline that can be traumatic. Again, all depending on the individual. So when we talk about trauma, there are these different types. There are kind of these different categories. They all fall within each other. It's just kind of split up this way to make it a little easier. So we first have our two types of trauma. We have our big T and our little t. Our big T events are usually these big one-time events that are really shocking. These are like natural disasters, war, combat zones, things like that. They're usually brief, but really impactful. Then there are little T events. These are pretty normal events. Again, death falls under this, but again, depending on the individual, it can be considered a trauma. And when we talk about trauma, it's how it impacts us, how long of these symptoms are we feeling? Does it impact our everyday life? So if it is, you can consider death a trauma. And so within those two types, we have our 7 types, which I'm just going to briefly go over these. So again, life transitions, pretty easy. We have vicarious trauma, which is again something we experience, especially as caretakers, whether you're caretaking for humans or non-humans. So vicarious trauma is when we take on other people's or animals' experiences. And so you hold on to their emotions. So if I have an animal who's really fearful, I might take on that fear myself, even though that's not mine. And so we can take on other people's traumas. So people going through surgery, things like that, or even the animal going through surgery, recovering, not recovering, we can take that on if it's traumatic for them too. Complex trauma, multiple traumas at the same time. Historical, these are usually going to impact minorities a little bit more. These are things like the Holocaust that had a big impact on as a major piece of history. But it was a trauma still. There's intergenerational trauma, which is traumas that are handed down through generations. So Holocaust is another great example of that. And so it goes through generations. We can carry that anxiety, depression through multiple generations. We have collective trauma, where a good example of this is 9/11 and the pandemic. It kind of happened to a lot of people at the same time. And then we have acute trauma, which is again that kind of big one-time event. And then within that, we have the 3 types. Again, acute, one-time big thing, chronic happens over and over, complex, multiple things happen at the same time. So I just want to give you a little bit of a background on exactly what trauma is. Again, it's a really big word. We hear it, but just want to give you background on what it actually is. All right. So now we're going to go into the stages of grief. So Kubler-Ross designed this. And so it goes through our 5 stages: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. However, many people think it's a linear. Here it's not linear, but there's this progression we go through. However, Kubler-Ross himself said this isn't true. And everyone's kind of all over the place depending on who they are. We can move forward, we can move back, we can stay where we are. It's all dependent. But we go through all of these at some point, is really what it comes down to. And then David Kessler actually helped develop this grief cycle. He's a grief psychologist. He's awesome. Highly recommend, if you're interested, checking out his website, grief.com. He has a lot of really cool resources. But he says they are tools to help us frame and identify what we may be feeling, but they're not stops on some linear timeline of grief. So again, just remember, there's no timeline, there's no linear projection. It's all over the place depending on the individual. Some people might go that route, go through these stages exactly, but not, in my experience, very few people. And then David Kessler actually added a 6th stage, which is called making meaning. And so what making meaning is, it is not about making meaning out of the death. That's really important. There's the point of death, death is natural. Yes, we might make some decisions sometimes on when an animal dies, but it still is a natural part of life. So it's not about making meaning out of the death. There's not really much meaning out of the death. What it's about is making meaning out of the life. So again, talking about that attachment, the relationship. What did that animal mean for you? And that's the 6th stage. And that usually is kind of after you go through these steps, you can start talking about your animal. But it's a really, really important piece of this. And so it's really important to think about not just the 5 stages, but the 6 stages. And so going off of that, I'm going a little bit deeper into this. 1 second, there we go. So again, here's the stages of grief and the experience you got, which is quite accurate as a grief therapist, or someone who works with grief. This is very typical. We kind of move back and forth, and 3 steps forward and 2 steps back. And so it's all over the place. So again, it's very unique to each person. And so some of these symptoms include anger, sadness, loss or increase of appetite, loss or increase of sleep, restlessness, irritability. Again, all depend on the individual. And what I'm going to show you here, let me see if I can do this without messing it up too much. There's a really great website here called Speaking Grief. And just going to move some things over. And there's this site, and it actually has all these different ways of how people feel grief. And so I'm going to play you just a little bit of like 1 or 2 of them. And again, this might be triggering. And so again, if you need to pause, take a break, whatever you need to do, that's okay.
The best way for me to describe grief is like you're at a crowded movie theater and you've bought your tickets for a rom-com and you're there and the movie starts and it's been going for about 15 minutes. And then all of a sudden the screen splits in 2 and melts and a horror movie starts in its place. This isn't the movie that you showed up for. This isn't what you bought tickets for. And everybody else around you is behaving as though this is all perfectly fine. And you're like, wait a minute, this isn't right. Like, this is a horror movie. This is not what I signed up for. And they're like, yeah, it's just a movie. Just eat the popcorn. This is great. Right? When you're inside intense grief like that, you're no longer watching the same movie everybody else is watching. And because nobody else is watching that movie, they all think everything is fine. Nothing is fine, right? And it's that dissonance between what's happening in your world versus what's happening in other people's world. and the fact that we don't recognize that everybody is walking around with their own personal movie screen all the time.
So there are multiple ones. I'll just play that one. But all of these here are the same. It's talking about grief and how multiple people and how we all view grief a little bit differently. So I think I think it's beautiful. I went through the website and listened to all of them and cried. And I think it's a really great place if you're like, I'm feeling this grief, or maybe I'm not feeling grief. And you just need a place to kind of be heard, or maybe feel like you can relate. It's a really great resource to be like, okay, I'm not alone. I resonate with this. Because everyone does experience it differently. And it is absolutely okay however you grieve. So yeah, I just can't stress it enough. It's unique to each person. All right. So what happens when we experience grief, anxiety, depression, crisis, trauma? What happens when we are stressed, really? So these are our 3 arousal zones. So I just want to give you some background on kind of what happens in our brain when we go through some really stressful situations. So what happens first is, well, let me talk through these first. So we have our hypoarousal zone, which is our freeze zone. Is where we are immobilized, our too little arousal zone. Then we have our hyperarousal zone, which is our fight or flight response. We have way too much arousal at this point. And then in the middle here, we have our optimal arousal zone, or ventral vagal response. So this is where this is kind of where people feel their best. They can tolerate stress the best. We're in the world, things like that. So usually what happens when people experience crisis, trauma, death, any type of major stressor, we move into our hypoarousal zone. So this is where we feel nothing. And I always tell people it is absolutely okay. Your body and your brain cannot handle anything. So it's a way to protect itself. So when your body is just like, you have a lot of stress, this is a really big moment, you're going to shut down a little bit because you just can't handle it, and that's okay. And so signs you are here, feeling dead, no energy, can't really defend yourself, you don't feel anything, you feel disconnected. Reduced physical movement's a big one. The can't say no is a little bit of a weird one, but the reason why that's there is because you really can't say no, because you don't have the energy to deal with any conflict or anything that would require energy from you. So a lot of times when people are in this zone, they're just kind of going with the flow, and people will be like, can you do this? And you're like, yeah, sure. So you're just going with the flow. You're kind of just like moving along, but you're not really there. So what happens as you are continuing to be there, you might start having feelings pop up. What eventually happens, and in my work, what happens is we start identifying these feelings popping up. We talk about what it feels like to be numb and be in the hypoarousal zone. Happens as we build awareness, we start feeling a little bit more. We go into our hyperarousal zone, which is that top one, again, our fight or flight response. So when people are here, this is when we feel everything at the same time, and it sucks. This is a place where people usually go back and forth between hypo and hyper, because we go to hyper, especially first few times, and we're like, oh my gosh, this is overwhelming. I feel angry, sad, frustrated, all the things at the same time. So you go back into hypo. And so it's okay. It's okay. Your body, you're going to do this fluctuation. It's going to be tiring and stressful, but it is really important to stick with that hyper arousal zone. So you can start processing and thinking about your emotions. This is where you can start talking about it. So say again, some signs you're here, racing thoughts, you're a little more shaky physically. Intrusive imagery is going to happen because your brain's kind of firing everything. You feel a little emotionally overwhelmed. You're hypervigilant, again, because you're kind of all over the place. You're a little on edge. Impulsivity, anger, rage. And so again, when we're here, it's really important to know you're here, and it's normal. It's overwhelming. It's not fun, but it's really, really important. So you have to start identifying what you're feeling. So you start talking about that. And then once you are able to start talking about your feelings, identifying, manage it just a little bit, you start practicing that management. And then you move into your ventral vagal response, your optimal arousal zone. So the signs you're here is you can feel and think simultaneously, experience empathy, your presence. So on the right here, right now, you can understand what's happening for you in that moment. Awareness of boundaries. So in those other zones, you do not have awareness of boundaries because your energy is either way too low or way too high. So you're not thinking that way. And you feel safe when you're in your ventral vagal response. And so it's really, really important, again, to recognize these are the waves you're going to go through. And what happens sometimes is we get to our optimal arousal zone. We're like, we're feeling good, got it all managed. And then you get triggered and you go right back through the process. And that is okay. And again, the more you practice recognizing and talking about your emotions, which we're about to dive into, the faster you can move through this. But it's really important to understand what's going on for you. All right. So how do you work through grief? So the big thing is you can't move too fast through it. A lot of people get in that hypo-arousal zone. They're like, oh, I don't feel anything. It's all good. And it is okay to say that. It is okay to be that way. But eventually happens is those feelings are going to catch up with you at some point. They're going to snap. They're going to go into hyper-arousal real fast. And it's going to be really intense. So it's really important to identify what you're feeling, so you can start moving through those zones. And the only way to move through grief, again, I actually encourage people to talk about their grief. That's the best way to do it. And, experience it. It's not fun, but if you try to move too fast or you live in it, that's not good either. So it's important to talk through it, which we'll talk about here in a minute. But you have to first learn to identify what you're feeling. And a lot of people are having a really hard time with this right now. A lot of people have been in hypo-arousal zone because of COVID for a really long time. And so it's okay to say, I don't actually know what I'm feeling. So if that's the case, this is one of my favorite images to work with. This is called the feelings wheel. And so we start off on the outside. So you can use this. You can Google this. Super easy to find. So you can start off on the outside and just stare at it and be like, okay, what am I feeling? And it's all these emotions. And then as you move inward, you can start narrowing it down a little bit. And in the middle of the circle are our core emotions. If you've ever seen the movie Inside Out, I love it. I recommend it. It's all about our core emotions. Really great movie. So it can help you kind of understand those emotions a little bit more. And so you can practice this. So if you're like, I feel numb, that's actually an emotion. It's okay to look at this and try to find where numb might live. You can also look at it and see if there are any other emotions coming up for you. And again, as you get more quicker at this, just move inward and see what that core emotion is. And these are just really corny phrases I love. They're awful, but they're really catchy. And I 100% back these up. So you can't heal until you feel. David Kessler said that. And I can't remember where I heard this one, but someone said it's better to express than suppress. And I just love that one. So you can hold on to those corny sayings if you would like. If not, I understand. All right. So some common feelings that you might experience when you're in grief. You might feel anger, sadness, depression, anxiety, shame, guilt, and relief even, which sometimes when you feel relief, it causes a guilt cycle. And I really want to talk on shame and guilt for a minute, because these are things that pop up, especially when we're talking about disenfranchised grief. Because again, society tells us just an animal. You shouldn't be doing that. Just move on, right? Kind of like what that, I was actually that, I thought that going to the movies, Ria was really relevant, what she said of everyone has grief. Everyone experiences it differently, whether it's human or not. And, she's saying, just watch the movie, popcorn, it's all good. I actually really like that metaphor. That's kind of what society tells us with animals. And so what happens is we start feeling bad or shameful of like, what's wrong with me? Am I grieving wrong? Am I should I not be feeling this way? And you absolutely should. Again, remember, attachment is the driver in animal grief. And so the difference between shame and guilt, because both of these will come up. So guilt is I did something bad or I did something wrong. So it might be like, I didn't take my dog out and I feel really bad. Like things like that is guilt. Like, I feel bad about that. Shame is very prevalent within disenfranchised grief because instead of saying, oh, I did something wrong, you say I am wrong. Or I am a bad person, I'm a bad owner, I am a bad partner, whatever that is, but you're encompassing yourself in that. And so what happens is you say, oh, with shame, be like, I'm grieving wrong, or I'm not a good enough person to move past this grief. That's kind of where that shame comes in. We're going to talk about how to combat grief here, shame, shame and guilt. But the big thing is you got to talk about it. Vulnerability takes away shame. And so it's really important, as much as it might hurt, as much as it might be scary, it's really, really important to talk about it. And that's why when I did this presentation in Lessons of Vulnerability, I was talking about this when I was preparing. I wanted to share why I enjoy doing grief work, and my why for doing it is my horse. And keep being vulnerable and open about that to fight that shame. I also like talking about him because he's super cute. And so another feeling that might come up is relief. So relief is a feeling that comes up, and sometimes when we feel that relief, especially if it's a euthanasia or if it was because of an animal loss, any loss actually, relief comes up, and then we automatically go into shame or guilt of like, oh my gosh, I'm awful for thinking that. And it's okay to feel relief, especially if this animal or this person took up a lot of time in your life and maybe you weren't able to do things for you and now you can. It's okay to feel relief. It is absolutely normal. And the more you just validate that for yourself and, be there for you, the more that shame and that guilt is going to slow down a little bit. And again and again, this is all dependent on the individual, but usually shame and guilt will always come with disenfranchised grief. So just something to be very aware of. All right. So, how to help feel your emotions. So this is that Inside Out movie. I love it. So how to help feel your emotions. So again, you got to feel it. It sucks and it's not fun. I absolutely understand, but you have to let yourself get those emotions out. It's kind of like gunk in the system. You got to get the gunk out. If you do, you're going to spend energy trying to push it down, and then it's going to come up. Usually at little things like someone dropped a pen and now you're enraged, or someone's like, you like what maybe a little thing like, oh, you didn't do the dishwasher right. And you're going to start crying. And it's okay to do that. Absolutely. But give yourself time to be able to actually be feeling the emotions from the experience you need to talk about. And it really helps you to process these events. All processing is, by the way, is just talking about it. It's a big fancy therapy word, but all it means is we are talking about it. Talking about it lets you express the emotions, understand your experience, and just kind of like work through those emotions. The more you let it out, the less powerful and less overwhelming those are going to feel for you. And so why is it important to understand our feelings? So if we don't know what we are feeling, we can't regulate ourselves or begin to process events. Again, these emotions are going to come up in the middle of nowhere, and it's going to be really hard to regulate or understand what's going on. We also have a more difficult time understanding our triggers. So as we're processing, we're talking about what things really stood out to us. So then when we're out in the world, we can know, okay, this is about to happen. This might be hard for me. What are my choices here? Right? How can I practice regulating myself? And so how can we feel our emotions when maybe we're in a home with multiple people? You might not feel like you have the space to do this. Some things you can do is, you can do regulation exercises, which we'll talk about in a little bit. So these are things you can do, like I know when I was in the darkest of dark in my grief, I would feel myself, bubbling up in the middle of a work meeting as we are talking about certain animals. And so I would practice grounding in that moment because that wasn't the time for it. And then when I had time later, I would kind of process it. So always practice that if you need to. Boundaries. So you can always ask to leave if you can. This is kind of within reason. You might not always be able to say, I gotta go. And that's okay. And so if you can always leave. You can pardon yourself, ask for space, say, I need a few minutes, I'll be back. Whatever you need to do, you are absolutely welcome when you can to, always advocate for yourself, but think of your realistic choices. And so if you're able to walk away, take a break, do what you need to do and come back, absolutely. Another thing you can do is you can always go for a walk. I I get overwhelmed in my life, so I have a spot at a park nearby that I go to when I need a little bit of a break and a little bit of a release. You can drive in a car and park it somewhere. I don't want you to cry while you're driving, but if you need to go park a car somewhere a little isolated and like get it out, great. Journaling is wonderful. If you're not a big journaling person, that is okay. You can always draw, you can color, do something to kind of express yourself how you need to. And then there are remembrance spaces, which we'll talk about, which in those places where maybe there's, you can create a space where maybe you can communicate without communicating. So you can put like whatever you need to express that you need time and you don't have to say it. So maybe you have like a communal area where you put a certain item where you're like, I need space and don't come to me. So things like that. So you can always set yourself up to and talk about, what can work for y'all when you need space. So I wanted to touch on this a little bit. So our body actually holds on to emotions and memories. So sometimes if you've ever been in a traumatic event or crisis, you might sometimes notice your body might clench up when something triggering happens. You might not even know it's triggering, but you feel your body tense and clench up, or you feel something going on. And then your brain is like, yes, this is what's going on. So there are a lot of theories and science out about this. So each emotion activates a distinct set of body parts. He thinks, and the mind's recognition of those patterns helps us consciously identify that emotion. So this is a really cool study. This was a study, I think it was about, I can't remember, 700 or 900 people, but they had a large amount of people color in where they felt a lot of emotion or a lot of activation, and then where they didn't feel anything in their body. And this was the common consensus. So it's pretty cool to see how our emotions are held in our body. And again, there's a lot of science out about this. And what I really find interesting about sadness is sadness actually activates our eyes a little bit. So our sinuses, it looks like, in our chest. And I do a lot of what's called somatic work. So when I work with clients with grief, we actually talk about where our emotions are in our body. And a lot of them say those same ones. So it's super, super interesting. And again, trauma, grief, memories are all held in our body. So again, if you're going through grief, you might notice your body kind of acting a little differently. And so it's really, really important to be in touch with that, as corny and hippy dippy as that sounds. It's really important to understand where our emotions are in our body. And so again, be aware. So if you're like, you're sitting there thinking, you might feel like tightness in your arm. I have some memories I work through and I hold them in my lower back. So those pop up, and it's okay. And it's just really important to understand how our body is responding and holding on to this grief and this trauma. So how to help processing and support. So again, processing just means talking about it. Nothing too fancy. That's all it is. The more you talk about it again, and the more you share your internal experience, the more you're going to be able to understand what's going on for you and be able to tolerate it a little bit more and more. So social support is absolutely crucial. So you can talk with a close friend or family member. I highly recommend you talk to someone who you know will understand the situation. If you go to someone who doesn't understand, it can be really hurtful, because I can't tell you how many times people told me to move on. They told me, especially when I was in the zoo field, there was a lot of grief. I worked with um, a geriatric population, so we had quite a few deaths. And a lot of my friends outside of where I worked, luckily I worked with people who really understood. But if I talked to people outside of that, they had a really hard time understanding why I was impacted. So talk with people who you know will be there for you and understand. It is okay to have friends and family who might not be the people for you to go to. So make sure these are people you trust, feel safe with, who you at least have a pretty good gut feeling that they're going to be supportive. And you can always, if that's not an option for you, there are plenty of other options for you to talk and process. So you can talk with a mental health professional, not a plug. But therapists, social workers are there for you. And our friends and family can always be there for you. There's some wonderful people in the world. And so if you feel good and you're processing with them, great. But just remember, they're not your therapists or your social workers. These are people there to really help you process and give you tools to cope. And then again, trusted and supportive friends and family. Outside of that, there are Facebook groups, which we have a few listed in the resources. So we have some Facebook groups. Conferences are actually a really good one, especially if you're in the animal field. Going to conferences with other animal people are really, really refreshing, because a lot of animal folks understand what animal loss and grief feels like. Community resources is community center, could be, any religious organizations. Anything that brings you comfort and helps you feel comfortable and safe is going to be wonderful. Support groups are great. So there aren't too many out there for pet loss and grief. There are quite a few peer-led ones. But as far as therapists leading ones, aren't too many, but they are out there for sure. And then therapy is also a really great resource. And again, it's just really important to understand your experience. So what happened for you during this grief? It also help you remember that life again, that making meaning aspect of it. And avoidance can lead to isolation, which will hinder your healing process and kind of pause you in the grief or move you backwards in the grief. So it's just, I can't stress enough how important it is to talk to people. All right, so how to help yourself. So let's say you're doing all this work, you're talking, and you're like, oh my gosh, this is a lot. I feel really sad. I feel angry, whatever that is. So how can you help yourself? So again, I remember only a trained therapist should help a client process grief. You can absolutely have friends and family help, but therapists and social workers are really there for you. So just remember that. So some things you can do: eat good food, drink water, get sleep, the basics. I know it feels really hard when we're in a crisis or trauma, grief. It can feel really, really hard, but it is really, really important. You can journal about how you are feeling about the loss. Again, you can process on your own. If you're not a journaler, I don't know if that's a word. If you're not enjoy journaling, I have a really hard time with journaling. What you can do is draw a gingerbread man outline and then actually color in what you're feeling. And so you don't even have to know your emotion. This is one of my favorite things to do. So you can just be like, oh, I feel blue in my chest. I wonder what that's about. And then you can start exploring that feeling a little bit more as you get more comfortable, more in tune with that. And then you can also go outside, again, going outside, getting fresh air is really, really good, as hard as it may feel. You can even go outside for like a minute or two, sit down, get some fresh air, and then you can go back inside if you need to, but go outside as much as you can. And then exercise. Physical movement is wonderful for your body. Because the more physical movement we have, the more we kind of move and become more aware of where our emotions are in our body, which helps us overall process it. And so being able to exercise, yoga, running, anything physical is really, really good to understand where we're holding emotions and memories in our body. Okay. So the kind of when you're ready to memorialize, it is really important to do this. This is kind of that making meaning. It'll help you share stories about your animal, help you understand the life they lived, the impact it had, the impact their life had on you. And so it's really important to celebrate that life. It might not feel like a celebration at the moment, but make a meaningful space for them so you can remember that life. And again, remember that meaning. What was the impact they had on you? I have a few clients when we start sharing stories of a loss, we end up laughing because we remember how funny or goofy, how sweet they were, and how that impacted the owners, or for my human clients, how it just impacted them in general. And there's no wrong or right way to memorialize or celebrate your pet. Absolutely not. It is whatever feels right to you. There's so many ideas out there, and so whatever feels right to you. But it's a way to integrate this individual into your life still, because they stick with us. So it's a really cool way to integrate. And so you can share pictures and stories, keep remembering and sharing how funny and wonderful those animals are. Again, think of a way to celebrate that life. And so you can do memorials or rituals. And again, there's a lot of ways to memorialize. So you can do a gravestone, create a place in your home that is special. And that way you can have them in your home and remember them as you walk around. Planting a tree is beautiful. Tattoos are really popular right now. I actually have that as one of my memorial pieces. And get a painting. Lots of really great artists in the area. And then you can also visit you and your pet's favorite place. If you're like, I want to do some sort of ritual, you can go to the place that was really important for both of you. And just remember all the times you had together. And when we talk about celebrating and like remembering the positive times, I do really quick want to talk about, it's not about that toxic positivity. Like, look at the bright side, look at all the wonderful things they did. What it's about is remembering they had a really positive impact on your life. There's an attachment, there's a relationship. That's why this grief is happening. And it's okay to recognize it's awful and it really is sad and it makes you feel a lot of really awful things. Absolutely. But integrate, the wonderful stories and the impact they had on you. Again, that making meaning is a really important stage, and that's what this is part of. All right, so I just wanted to leave you all with some grounding exercises. So if you're feeling overwhelmed and you're like, oh my gosh, I can't take this anymore, I'm in a work meeting and I don't want to cry right now. These are some things to regulate your system a little bit. So again, it's not to keep pushing it down and ignore it, but it's just to regulate yourself, get yourself back in the moment. And then you can process later, let yourself have the time you need when you feel comfortable and safe to do so. So box breathing is a wonderful, quick exercise. And real quick, grounding exercises they're actually meant to like bring you back to the ground. Like that's why it's called that. They're called grounding exercises to bring you back to the ground and back in the moment. And so we have our box breathing. So it's a really great way to regulate your system, as it's saying. It's getting oxygen flowing. It's getting you to kind of really think about breathing. And so there are a bunch of videos out there on this. So if you're a visual person, there are lots of visuals on this. But all you're going to do is you're going to breathe in for 5 seconds through your nose. You're going to hold your breath for 5 seconds. Breathe out your mouth for 5 seconds, and then hold your breath again for 5 seconds. And you do this for about a minute. And so again, that's a video right there, but you can find any video you like. Sorry, dog's very itchy all of a sudden. But it's just a nice way to regulate yourself. And you can definitely do this for more than 1 minute if you feel like you need that. But it's a really nice, quick way. And you can absolutely do this while other people are around. They don't have to, especially if they're not looking at you, you're not talking. You can easily do this, and no one really knows. Okay. Excuse me. The senses exercise is one of my favorites. I utilize this whenever I feel overwhelmed. It's very, very helpful because it's really about bringing you back to the world and like really taking notice of where you are now instead of being in your head, either in the past or the future. And so you just go through, list 5 things you can see, and you can get really detailed. Usually we start off really general. So and be like, I see a computer, I see a dog, I see blah, blah, blah. But you can start getting really specific of like, oh, I see a little scratch on my laptop underneath some words here. So you can get really, really specific as you start practicing it more. And then you have 4 things you can physically feel. And then 3 things you can hear. Usually once we get here, people want to rush through it a little bit because it is a little uncomfortable just sit and be like, what do I hear? But take your time. It's meant to slow you down and take notice of where you're at in the moment so you can get back in the world a little bit. 2 things you can smell, and then list something you like to taste. Usually it says, what can you taste right now? Doesn't mean to go lick something. It just means like take notice. Again, get in the moment where you're at right now, what's going on for you right now. And breathe while you're doing this. So these are really great exercises. You can practice really quick. The more you practice it, the quicker it goes for you. So there's a whole bunch of other grounding exercises out there, but these are 2 really fast, easy ones. And then again, here's some resources for everyone. Brett's going to send these out as well. So I won't go over these too much, but the big important one I want to the big crisis line I want to recommend to anyone and everyone is the National Suicide and Crisis Line. So you can now call or text, which is really nice. So it's 988, call or text. You can also go to the website and there's a chat. So you don't even have to go call anyone. You can just text, go online. Super easy to get in touch with someone. And even if it's not a crisis, but you're just having a hard time, still call or text them and someone will be on the other line to chat with you. So it's a really great resource. And then we have some websites here. So American Association for Pet Loss and Bereavement, they have some really great resources. Speaking Grief is where I showed you those videos. So also have some great resources on grief in general. These are just 2, there's a whole lot of Facebook groups. So if you look up pet loss and grief, there's a whole bunch out there, but these are the 2 that I'm a part of and I really have found beneficial. And so we also have some books here if you like to read and have the time to read, or if you like listening to audiobooks. So Dark Nights of the Soul, don't be scared by the dramatic title. It's one of my favorite books. So it is about staying and experiencing grief, depression, is about understanding that experience. And the more you sit with it and process and talk about it, the more you learn about yourself, and you can you really learn about yourself during these times. So it's a really awesome, impactful book. And then Body Keeps the Score is all about how our body holds on to emotions. So it's the science behind that, as well as tools to kind of process those emotions. And some really nice podcasts if you like Unlocking Us with Brene Brown. So Brene Brown is a social psychologist, if you haven't heard of her. And she specializes and studies shame. So she talks a lot about shame. If you haven't heard of her, seen her videos, I highly recommend you look up her TED Talk on YouTube. It's all about shame. And again, vulnerability fights shame. And she talks all about the science of that. And she's also really hilarious. She's not like a boring psychologist. She is actually hilarious and I quite enjoy her. Man Enough podcast, which is all about men's topics. In particular, it focuses on the social stigma of men not being able to express themselves. So it's a really great podcast, and every episode is really focusing on sharing stories, being vulnerable. What is that like to be vulnerable as a man? So it's really awesome. Healing with David Kessler is all about grief. So it can be pretty triggering, but I find it very helpful because he talks about the science of grief. He has people on and they kind of share their grief stories. And so all these are found on Spotify. And so if any of these resonate with you, you could go and find those. And then this is where we'll do some Q&A, but like Bert was saying, I do offer therapy works. I do individual counseling, both in person and virtual. I also have a weekly pet loss grief support group, which is so powerful. So if you're interested, just reach out and I'd be happy to answer any questions about that or get you started if you're ready. And that is that. So I'll go ahead and start doing some questions here.
And Janna, I have just a quick note for you.
Oh, sure.
Want to first say thank you so much for your time and expertise today. It was very impactful in the right way. So thank you for joining us today and sharing that information.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Absolutely. And thank you all for joining us today. I did put the questionnaire form link in the chat. And I know I said that I wasn't going to record the Q&A. However, some people that entered questions are not on. And
Okay.
I'm wondering if we could go ahead and still go through the questions. I've made them more generic. I took out names. And maybe we could go through those because I do think they would reach a general audience as well. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, I am absolutely comfortable with sharing questions or recording these. Yeah.
Wonderful. And if anyone has a question that they would not like recorded, let me know. I'll press pause and we'll get to that in order. So feel free to go ahead and put your questions in the chat directly to me or in the form, and then you can go ahead and take it away, Janna. Let me know if you have any questions.
Yeah, perfect. So go ahead and pull up that form. So we'll go with the first question. So how to deal with people who think it has been long enough? I mean, I guess this is people who think you've been grieving for too long or don't understand why you're not ready to get another pet, things like that. So how to deal with people is, this is something a lot of empathetic people have problems with, but boundary setting. You have to you have to tell them or not tell them. Maybe those aren't your people to go to. And if they keep reaching out to you and saying, hey, are you okay? Do you want to go look at pets? How are you feeling? And you know, they're just like wanting to kind of coach you through it. Just, maybe those aren't the folks to talk to about this. You can talk to them about other things, but you're like, hey, I don't feel like talking about this with you right now, but I appreciate reaching out. You can always appreciate people for showing concern. And I do want to say with grief in general, it's very normal for people to want you to move through it. Especially pet loss, because again, there's a societal norm that we should be moving fast. That people are like, oh, it's been a week, let's move through it. Because as a human species, we want to avoid whatever's uncomfortable. So we want to move through things that make us feel bad really fast. Because if we didn't, right, if our brain didn't tell us to avoid it, we'd be dead. That's natural selection. So just know it's normal. Be like, I'm going to get through this as fast as possible. And for other people to also think that, but in particular with disenfranchised grief. And so again, just advocate for yourself. Say, hey, thank you for reaching out. Don't feel like talking right now, but appreciate it. And find your people to get support from, whether again, it's Facebook group, support group, community resources. There are wonderful resources out there. And so find your people to get that support from, to validate what you're doing is okay. It's okay to grieve. It's okay to take time to grieve. And it's all different on the individual and that attachment. I'll be honest, I've told Britt this, I lost my horse probably at this point, it's probably been about 2 years. And I still grieve him, and that's okay. It's easier, but I know there's still grief living there. And so just know it takes time. And just remember, it's based on the relationship, and it's so, so important to find people who will validate and let you know it's okay. So find those folks that will be there for you and say, it's okay, you're here. So I hope that answers that question. If not, you can always email me. I'm happy to elaborate more. And then our other question we got, oh, here's a comment from Carrie. Time heals all wounds. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, time helps us face the next day. I totally agree with that. It's just time is time is time, but it's all about the experience. So there is no timeline. So sometimes it takes days, weeks, months, years, depending on the individual. So I agree. That's a very well said statement. All right. So another question we got was, how do you suggest handling the guilt? And this is from two different sides. It looks like not necessarily making the decision, but maybe potentially doing something that caused a disease or a death, doing something that caused something. So how do you handle that guilt? Probably leading to some sort of diagnosis potentially. That's a really hard one. It sounds like that's some shame coming into it as well. So again, talk through it. And through talking through it, what will also happen is you'll realize to have empathy for yourself, right? We are all human. We all make mistakes. And yes, some mistakes might have more of an impact, but I am a firm believer in you don't know till you know. And an exercise I tell people to do when they're feeling shame or guilt and they're having a hard time getting out of it is I'll have them pretend that they are their best friend. And I want them to tell their best friend who's in the same situation, feeling the same thing. Like, what would you say to your best friend in this scenario? Usually it's extremely empathetic and so sweet and it's really, really wonderful. However, their inner voice when they're talking to themselves is the complete opposite. So it's really helpful to kind of take a step back, switch how you're viewing this, not switch how you're viewing the situation, but maybe view it from a different lens and see how that feels for you. And really, it's okay to feel guilt, especially if maybe you made a mistake that led to something that wasn't good for another animal or human. But again, you don't know till you know. And if you're looking back, you're like, I honestly made a mistake. You made a mistake and it's okay to learn from. And again, talking through this with people who you trust and know are there support you are going to be really, really helpful because they can give you that outside perspective. Also, if you have honest people, that's also really important. So honestly, with guilt, it just takes time and you just have to keep thinking through it and validating yourself and really thinking, nothing was intentional. For, some people it might be intentional. I'm going to guess for pretty much everyone. For most people, it's unintentional. So having that empathy for yourself will help with that guilt. Really, really good question. And then the guilt having to euthanize, that's a really, really big one. This is something that's brought up in the support group quite a bit. So with that, it's just talking through it. Again, you have to talk through. If you keep holding it in, that shame is going to keep circulating and you're going to keep hearing this negative voice in your head that says you are bad, you did the wrong thing, right? That's more guilt. But you did the wrong thing instead of being like, did you actually do the wrong thing or was it the best choice for you and your animal? 9 times out of 10 people euthanize for all the right choices and they rake over every single choice they've made along the way. And some of this guilt comes from we feel relief and then we question, did I do this for me or for the animal? That is a huge question that comes up. And I just tell people, take a breath, slow down, and really ask yourself. Because if you're grieving this animal so much, you probably, I'm going to assume, but 9 times out of 10, you did it for the right reasons for the animal. And it's okay too that it's a relief and it might feel a little like little weight off your shoulders. That is absolutely okay to feel, especially if you've been in caregiving mode for a long time. And again, when you're thinking of euthanizing, you might be experiencing anticipatory grief. And then when the loss happens, it kind of re-triggers a different type of grief for you. So just be aware that, and yeah, I'm wishing you had done it differently at home versus the clinic. You know, you can always look back and reel over the what ifs. But just what I tell people is you got to trust yourself, have empathy for yourself, and trust the decision. Did you have other people telling you it was okay? Did you do everything you could do? Questions like that. And again, talk through with people. Make sure, you have people voicing this with you and processing this. And usually they're going to say you did everything you could and you did the right thing. And again, it just takes time. You could do this for days, weeks, months, and you still feel this guilt. It takes time. But if you keep talking about it and processing and really practicing that empathy and trust for yourself, it's going to be really, really helpful for you. And then this other question is, how do you keep the memory strong? Yeah. Yeah, this is a really big one. And that's where memorials are going to be really, really important in sharing stories. Sometimes too, it's really nice to make a little scrapbook or journal memories in particular, like a little storybook. But there are absolutely ways to keep the memory alive. Yeah, you never want to forget how much you love your animal. I'm just reading some of the comments. Yeah, you never want to forget how much I am loved you. And again, that's where they're making meaning. A question I pose is how did this animal impact who you are today? And what it does, it kind of lets us think about like who you are as a person has been impacted by, the animal that has been lost. And so thinking about that, it's really integrating a part of them into you, as again, as hippy dippy as that sounds, but part of your personality and part of who you are at your core can be contributed to your animal sometimes. But again, sharing stories, having a place as a memorial where you can go and sit with them or stand with them or remember them, is going to be crucial to remembering them. And again, not living in that sadness, not, just being there in those memories. But when you're like, oh, I miss them, you can go and remember them very vividly. A really, really good question. It's perfectly normal to not be thinking about them as much as you're processing. But have a place where you can go to where where you're like, oh, I miss them. I really want to remember them. Go to that special spot. And that'll be really helpful for you. And so do other dogs notice when they're gone when you've more? I haven't done much research in this, but I will say my experience as a trainer, I have noticed this. Again, very different depending on the individual. And sometimes, we can quantify it as it's a change in the environment. And so maybe they're responding to that. But I have seen dogs get more subdued. I have seen dogs experience what we might label as a depression when maybe another dog in the home, especially if they're really bonded, leaves. So I have seen animals get affected in different ways by a loss. Absolutely. And do they forget? I don't know. That's an awesome question. I would really love to study that, the science behind that. I will say animals have amazing memories, especially through smell. And so do they forget? They might forget in the moment. Animals are very much in the moment. But I will say if a scent popped up that reminded them of that individual, they would probably have something triggered there in my experience as a trainer. Oh. And then another question, is wanting another dog a good idea or a bad idea? And is it ever too soon? That is another awesome question that comes up. It is really dependent on each person. It really is. And what I tell people again is, you got to work on trusting yourself, as corny as that is. And when you have that gut feeling of I'm ready, you're ready. And if you're not ready, that's okay. I have some clients when they lose animals, they get another one immediately. And for some of them, it's great. For some of them, they knew they rushed it. And that's okay. It was a way to kind of cope and like dive into another animal. And that's totally okay. They still love their animal. But it's all about building awareness around that, you know. But a lot of people do say, you know, they'll come and be like, I'm ready. Or we'll talk about this, and at their gut and their core, they're like, oh, I'm not ready. So think about what life would be like with another dog. And if it's really hard for you to think about that, it might not be the time. But if you're starting to think about maybe thinking about it more and more day to day, might be something to explore. Or maybe go where, you know, go to a shelter, go to you know, go to places where there are animals around and see how that feels for you. See what it feels like to be around other dogs. You can even volunteer if you have time. See how it feels for you to just work with another dog. And that'll give you some information too. Really, really great question. That's a really, really good question. It comes up a lot, but trust your gut on that. It's awesome. And then let me see this other question. So when I do something fun or something that makes me happy, I instantly feel bad, like I shouldn't be feeling happy already after losing such a big part of my life. That is a really big theme in any type of grief. There's this idea that when we have grief, we should be really sad. And you're going to be sad, you're going to be angry, but you should have good days eventually. You really should. And sometimes when we feel that, especially after a loss of an animal who maybe would be there for our good days, if they were still with us, we start feeling shame and regret, like, oh, I shouldn't be doing this because they would have been here. Like, I still need to grieve. Again, there's no wrong or right way to grieve. And as you're grieving, you're gonna have days, you're gonna have days where you are gonna feel more sad and depressed. There are gonna be days where it feels a little lighter. And that's okay. You're going to go through these fluctuations. And that's part of this. You're processing, what does it feel like to be happy without this animal in my life anymore? What does it feel happy to not have this in a human relationship? What does it feel like to not have this person around anymore? Like feel happy without this person anymore. And so the same thing happens, and it is okay to be happy. You should be happy. And really it's just about, you have to have an internal dialogue of like, oh, I'm happy right now. Why am I feeling shame about this? Getting awareness of why does this happiness make you feel regret and sad? And yeah, if it's a lot of times about like, you know, there's the stigma about grief. We should be sitting in it and only be sad. Grief is all over the place. And you should be happy. Go be with friends, go do things that rejuvenate you and like bring you energy. You know, life is fun. There are great parts of life. And so remember that. And life is going to be different without this individual in your life. And so it's about rebuilding who you are without this individual in your life anymore. Again, whether it's an animal or human or non-human. It's a really good question. I hope that answered that. And if not, feel free to follow up with me. And then last question, how would you suggest is the best way to help someone else that has an ailing animal that can't let the animal go to the bridge? Yeah, great question. What would be the best way to approach to help them realize they're keeping the animal from themselves when the animal's not living, just existing? Oh my gosh, what a cool, great question. What a hard question. And what a hard situation that is. And I'm so sorry that is the situation for you. That is a really, really hard place to be. It's hard. It's one of those things you don't have control over. Unfortunately, you can be there for them, but they might not always want to hear what you have to say, unfortunately. And that is a really harsh reality of we cannot control what other people do with their animals. You know, if it gets to a point where it's a welfare, then you can go that route. But it sounds like the animal's living, just kind of like you're saying, just existing. And some people have a really hard time letting go. Again, a lot of people, especially right now, especially during COVID, a lot of people got animals and became very attached to their animals because they weren't as attached to people because we couldn't be. So we became very attached to our animals. And so when these losses happen, especially if we have a really strong attachment, sometimes it's really hard for people to let go and recognize they're actually harming and hurting. And people don't always want to hear that. And again, what I tell people, as hard as it is, you can voice yourself, but people might not listen. And what can you control? What can't you control? You unfortunately have no control over what people do with their animals. And it's a really hard thing to go through. And so if your friend wants you to be there for them and sit with them and talk with them, bring it up. Advocate for that animal. Absolutely. But if they're not asking and they don't want you to be there, that might be where maybe, you can be there for them if you can, but if it's too hard, it's okay to set up boundaries. You can also provide resources if they're open for it. Like, hey, I know you're having a hard time, but here's some resources about euthanasia and some ways to kind of think about if it's the right or wrong choice. If they haven't already, there are also a lot of like measurements they can take. There are ways to measure it and quantify it if they're that type of personality, if like you have a scoring system. So that's another way to do it. But it's a really sucky situation, unfortunately, and I really feel for you, and I'm so sorry that's what it is. And yeah, what Carrie is saying, like veterinarians can do that too. So you can have them reach out, or if it's someone's reaching out to you, you can connect them with their veterinarian. Yeah, it's a really, really hard thing. And like Britt's saying, it's a day-to-day thing, and you can be there and hear them out and just realize you don't have control and you can do what you can. If you are comfortable being there for them when this is happening, and you can sit there and be there and listen, or not listen, just sit there with them, absolutely. But if you can't, that's okay too. So that's a really, really awesome question. Again, if I didn't answer that completely, let me know, but that's a really big one. So thank you for having that question. Thank you to everyone else for answering those questions or asking those questions. And I think those are all the questions we had come in.
That's it. Yes, there were plenty. Thank you all for sharing those questions, and Janna for answering all of those questions so well. We appreciate it. And it looks
Yeah,
like,
thank you for having me, Britt. This has been great. And thank you everyone for being here. I know this is a tough topic, so thank you for being here. I appreciate it.
yes, definitely. Hopefully you all feel safe and supported, and we will follow up with resources that will probably be more than you want, but that's always a good thing, right? Better more than less. And feel free to reply to me if you would like to connect with Janna, but I'll also incorporate her information. And at this point, we can end now and be right on time for you all to finish out your evening. But please know that we're here for you, and if you need anything at all, just reach out. So thank you all so much.